Good morning, and happy Father's Day to those of you to whom it applies. This holiday is like several other holidays throughout the year in that when you are a preacher, there's a certain expectation of a certain kind of lesson that goes along with that. And there's nothing wrong with that sort of tradition. It's a time when people are thinking about something, and so you give them something to think about. And this morning we are going to take a look at a father in the Bible, but really the relationship that we see him more in is that of a father-in-law. And specifically, it would be the father-in-law of Moses. And so this is Jethro. We'll be in Exodus chapter 2 to start out with, but we'll end up in Exodus chapter 18. But either way, you can open up to the book of Exodus. This lesson also happens to be, kind of like we did at Mother's Day, it is a part of a series of the faith of unbelievers and getting to watch somebody who is not necessarily a follower of God becoming just that over time. And so we'll see that with Jethro here as well. Like I said, though, in Exodus chapter 2, and then we'll be in verse 16 to start with. Exodus 2:16 says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs of water for their father's flock. And then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And so when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, 'How is it that you have come so soon today?'" So this just introduces us very basically into this story. But one thing about chapter 2 here, even though it's talking about Jethro, it doesn't call him by that name. Instead, it actually calls him by a different name of Reuel, which means friend of God. Now, when he became known as friend of God, that's a different question altogether. But what we do know about him from this text is that he is the priest of Midian. Well, that is informative if we know what that means in the first place. And the problem is nobody quite knows what he was a priest of. Really, there's two options. Either because the Midianites are kind of related, probably related to the Israelites, it may be that he is somehow a priest of the true God. That's suggested by some. I kind of doubt it for a few reasons that will come up throughout the lesson. But the other option is that he is a priest of not the true God, meaning he's a priest of some other God, one of the many Canaanite gods. But if that's the case, then we'll get to see him progress from this place of no faith to a place of faith in God. In verse 19, it says, "And they said, 'An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock.'" And so in verse 20, he said to his daughters, "And where is he?" And so through this story, we won't read the whole thing, but this is the story of Moses getting married. And he gets married to one of the daughters of this man, Jethro, specifically Zipporah. Now for her part, later on in chapter 4, she will save Moses from displeasing God and potentially losing his own life even. And so that means that Jethro has raised at least one pretty good daughter, because of the things that we see there with her later on. But the rest of the story that we want to pick up with takes place in chapter 18. So Exodus chapter 18. There's not a whole lot of other things mentioned about Jethro up till this point. But here we will pick back up in Exodus chapter 18. And we'll start in verse 1. It says, "Then Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back." Okay, so two things are going on here. One, Jethro hears about the works of God. Now, who hadn't heard about the works of God that was in this area at the time? This is immediately after the actual exodus from the land of Egypt, which means everybody's heard what has happened. But he's not heard it from his own family, not yet. He'll talk to Moses in just a little bit in the text here. But then in verse 2, we also find out something that has eluded scholars as to an answer what the timeline looks like here. But in verse 2, it just says that Jethro took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back with her 2 sons in verse 3. And so at some point between the time that Moses goes to Israel and the end of the 40 years in the wilderness, sometime in there, Moses has sent his wife and his 2 children to live with their father-in-law. That's all we really know, but at this point they're being reunited. And so that's where we pick up with the story here. In the rest of this story, they are reunited at Sinai. This is in verses 6 and 7. And then Moses is going to tell his father-in-law about the events that have taken place. So pick back up in verse 8 with me. Exodus 18, verse 8. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord." So as we're getting to be a little bit more familiar with Jethro, his story unfolds like this. We're assuming here that he has started out as a priest of a God that is in opposition to the true God, necessarily, but now he has heard from a distance about the works of this true God. Okay? Then he hears it from Moses directly. And when he hears it from Moses, for his part, he believes it. Now consider what Moses is telling him. Moses is telling him that we were in the land of Egypt. I went down there, and that God, through me, performed various signs. I threw my staff on the ground, it became a serpent, and it swallowed up the other serpents that were formed by the magicians of Egypt. I was there when God turned the Nile River into blood. I was there when he caused frogs to come up out of it. I was there for the darkness. I was there for the death of the firstborn of all of Egypt. And then, after that, we left. And my God parted the waters, and millions of people along with me came safely to this place. Now, it would be kind of hard to explain how all of Israel was there with Moses, but can you imagine hearing this for the first time? Most of us have grown up hearing this story, but it's just happened. And Jethro, we wouldn't think it strange if he heard this story and was a little bit incredulous about it, didn't really believe that that's what had taken place, but that's not his response. It's the opposite. He says, "Blessed be the Lord who has done these things." And so he does believe that these things have taken place, but more than that, he's going to express what that will change in him. Verse 11. Jethro says, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. For in this very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So Jethro responds not just by believing the news that his son-in-law has told him, but from there, he says, "Now I know something to be true, that your God is greater than all the other gods." Now, if he is a priest of a Canaanite god, a false god, or multiple false gods, then what does that mean for him? It means that he's saying even those ones that maybe I've grown up worshiping, this God, he's not like those. And he's greater than those gods, and he's greater especially than the Egyptian gods. Because as he says it there, when they behaved proudly, he's kind of adding that characteristic to the gods of Egypt. He says when they behaved proudly, the Egyptians themselves even behaved proudly against God. He proved himself to be above them. And so that's what he believes now. Then he goes on to offer a burnt offering and a sacrifice. Not only that, I don't know if it's because of his role as priest, but for whatever reason, the leadership of Israel was willing to take part of this sacrifice and of this meal that they would share afterward. And so we could spend a little time there, but we'll move past it for now. But we'll just say this, that what it does show is at least some kind of mutual approval of each other, of the Israelites toward Jethro, of Jethro toward all of them. The rest of the story in chapter 18 is usually referred to as Jethro's advice, which is pretty straightforward, but it is exactly what it sounds like. It's Jethro giving his son-in-law advice, which for all of you with fathers-in-law in the room, that sounds a lot like a father-in-law, right? Giving unsolicited advice to the son-in-law at any given time. And so that's what happens here. But what he has done is he's watched Moses from sunup to sundown dealing with the people. And he says that that's not going to work. And so in verse 17, he says, "The thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who you are with, or are with you, will surely wear yourselves out, for this is too much for you, and you are not able to perform it by yourself." Verse 19, "Listen now to my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God will be with you." So Jethro, his advice is actually this, that instead of you hearing all the complaints of the people and every disagreement that comes up, you appoint smaller groups to be headed by other important figures in Israel, elders of each given clan, that they would then take some of that responsibility off of Moses. It would be better for Moses, it would be better for the people as well. But what he says about that advice that he gives is that it is basically the advice of God, which on the one hand sounds kind of bold for him to say, but it also may just be recognizing that there's wisdom in what he is saying. And there certainly is. This is still good advice even today. It's just delegation in business. But he also says this to kind of offset any boldness that might come across. In verse 23, he says, "If you do this thing," that is the advice that I'm giving you, "and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all the people will also go to their place in peace." If you do what I've said, but more importantly, if God also commands you to do this alongside me just telling you. And so what he has shown is a subservience to God, a willingness to say, this is what I think, but not only that, if it's what I think and if it's what God approves of, then you should actually follow the advice, then you should listen. And of course, this advice will be followed, and it will be followed for literally centuries to come after this. Seems to be the groundwork for the Sanhedrin later on, but it all comes back to right here. So what do we take from Jethro? Because this is as far as we'll get in his story today. Really, we can look at Moses and at Jethro as far as learning from them. One thing we might say, just to start out, is that sometimes good advice comes from unexpected places. Doesn't mean it's always going to be your father-in-law, but in this case it is. And the reason we say unexpected here, though, is Jethro an Israelite? He's not. Is he some kind of prophet? No, Moses is, in fact. Is he a priest? Yes, but not like Aaron the high priest is. And yet he, this potentially pagan individual, but certainly not an Israelite to start with, he offers this advice to Moses, and things work out pretty well. A couple other areas we can kind of look at Jethro and think of these things as being admirable qualities. One, he shows hospitality. So when we say hospitality here, we mean it kind of literally, that he's taking someone into his home. This is not an example to say that if you have someone show up at your door, you should marry off one of your daughters to them. And the timeline's probably a little bit longer than it seems like in the story here. There may be a period of months or even years before this marriage takes place. But what he does is he accepts someone into his home, and curiously enough, the way that his daughters tell him is that he's an Egyptian. Now, Moses is not actually an Egyptian, but he was raised in Egypt. He'd be wearing the things of Egypt, potentially. And so he is hospitable to a stranger, let alone a foreigner from a somewhat distant land. But he shows that example. He also shows an example of humility. We mentioned this already, but he puts himself below God. Not his God necessarily, but below a God that he believes in, who's able to do things greater than all the other gods that are available to be worshipped. This humility that he shows and taking a look at his story as a progression of faith from start to finish, we can say of humility, and for those of you who have come to Christ at any point, but especially later in life, humility goes a long, long way in successfully converting from yourself toward God. It is one of the first things, the most important, the most necessary in order to convert. Now, in this progression of faith, we'll tie this in with being a father as well. But as we work through this, we see from the start that Jethro is a decent person. He's a probably even pretty good father. Like we said, Zipporah turned out pretty well. And yet being a decent person or being a good father is not enough to save yourself or to save anyone else, especially your children. You can be a fun father, parent, we can extend it to that at least. You can be the one that's always there to take them to whatever event it is. You can be the one that even has some words of wisdom for them to live by in general, in earthly terms, but none of that's enough. It has to go beyond that. Now, through this story, we see Jethro introduced to and experiencing a familiarity with someone who believes in God, that being Moses. And certainly Moses can and should set that example, even kind of the reverse here, of a son-in-law to a father-in-law. And so it could be that the son is influencing the father rather than the father influencing the son. But in this case, we kind of see Moses as that phrase that we use sometimes, that you may be the only sermon that someone ever hears or the only Bible someone ever sees, something along those lines. And certainly that's an application to make here, that any father is going to do well to be an example to their children. But you can be a good example all day long as well. You can be an example of a morally upright person, of someone who keeps their word, someone who has integrity in all situations, and that's wonderful. But that's not enough either. As a father, we're saying, for children, at some point it has to switch from a familiarity with just someone who is a good example to familiarity with God, the true God, and making that change. At some point, the example's not enough. There has to be intentional teaching that's taking place too. That doesn't always happen, but that's how it should be. Now, for any person, but since we're talking about fathers a little bit anyway, when it comes to a change, and the biggest change someone can make in life, at some point, as a father, as a parent, even as a child, you have to switch over from believing in something and maybe having heard about God to where Jethro gets to in this story, which is this, that he believes in God's betterness, his better than qualities compared with other gods. And so until someone believes that God is better than anything else that is available to them, until I believe that God is more capable than myself, more capable than my job, more capable than my own intelligence, more capable than my parenting, more capable than anything I can do, until that changes and I say God is above all of that. And so he is the one that must be followed. But until he is alone, the only answer, the only truth, the only hope that I have, there's not going to be a whole lot of change in me. And if that change doesn't start in me, then as a father, it's not going to go anywhere beyond me either. But if a father, if a parent, starts with a conviction like this, and starts with the love of God like this, then everything else will fall into place. This morning, a couple of encouragements to kind of close us out. One, I don't know how old Jethro is here. Even if Zipporah is a little bit younger than Moses, Moses is already getting up there in years by the time we start this story. And so Jethro is probably in later middle age. Let's say he's 60, 70, maybe 80 years old. And so what's one lesson? That it is not too late to start your story of faith, to start being an influence on your children, to be an influence on your grandchildren. It doesn't have to be too late as long as you're willing to make a change. But the other thing we'll say, this goes from Moses back to Jethro. One, we can be an influence that brings someone in contact with God. That's what Moses does in this story. But we can also be the other side of this, where we can be someone who is willing to be led closer to God. Because that's Jethro and his place in this story. This morning, you have an opportunity as someone who hopefully believes in God, but someone who could be an example to a whole other generation of people that are wanting to find God, wanting to find purpose in this life. This morning, as a father, be a father that leads your children to Christ. This morning, it may be the other way around. Maybe you're a child who needs to lead their parents closer to Christ. Whatever need you may have, whether it's to become a child of God or whether it's to come back to Him if you've strayed away, we ask that you do that now as we stand, as we sing.